Hello, everyone, and welcome to our sixth episode of It's in Denver's Nature podcast. This is a podcast produced in collaboration with Denver Parks and Recreation and Denver Community Media, where we are in the studio today. If you'd like to learn more about Denver Community Media, check us out at denvercommunitymedia.org. We're here in the studio with a few guests who are going to discuss the topic of habitat protection. Welcome, everyone, and I would like for you all to introduce yourselves, starting from my left.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Mara Evans with the City and County of Denver, and I'm the Open Space Operations Supervisor. My team has the privilege and the honor of being able to steward a lot of these habitats in our park system.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan.
My name is John Mola. I'm an assistant professor at Colorado State University, where my lab does a lot of research projects on pollinator conservation and ecology. And recently we did a field season working with 25 different parks across Denver to assess pollinator biodiversity in those parks.
Hello, I'm Vicki Vargas Madrid. I work for Denver Parks and Mountain Parks. I am the Education and Wildlife Program Manager. Our team focuses on wildlife habitat conservation and protection, as well as environmental education.
Cool. Thanks, Vicki.
And I'm Sensory Eads. I'm Assistant Director in Planning, Design, and Construction, and specifically oversee urban ecology and trails. And we work across the different groups in the department to identify restoration projects and a lot of our landscape transformation projects.
Well, welcome, everyone. I can't wait to get started really discussing the topic of habitat protection. In a previous episode, we covered the importance of landscape transformation. So moving away from the idea of the perfectly mowed bluegrass and embracing more the concept of native landscape and native plants. How's landscape transformation linked to habitat protection? Are those two connected, and how?
It might surprise some people to know that the City and County of Denver actively stewards around 6,000 or so acres of parkland. A little bit more than half of that is open space and natural areas, ranging all the way from the streams and rivers and creeks and gulches on the west side of the city to these big expanses of restored prairie out over by Central Park and DIA. We see all sorts of critters while we're out there taking care of the spaces. We see beavers, we see snowy egrets, we see double-breasted cormorants, we see red foxes. So yes, of course, the parks that we take care of are intimately linked to not only habitat for species, but also habitat for humans. They provide a space for humans to go out and recreate and contemplate, breathe fresh air, enjoy the sunlight, appreciate natural beauty.
Transitioning from, a typical just full bluegrass park to more of a hybrid landscape type where you have some bluegrass and some native areas, or even just really expanding and building out more open space, purely open space areas. We're seeing much more diversity and species type. And so we're creating those habitats. And so, back to your question is there is a direct link to transitioning these landscapes and protecting and creating habitat.
Some of the data analysis that we've been doing recently, and it's preliminary, but sort of suggests that these local scale factors, so basically DPR or other municipalities buying up land or taking over the management of land, putting back in native landscapes and increasing the plant diversity does seem to have an immediate and positive effect on pollinator diversity, for example. So in our data so far, it really looks like things like plant species richness or density of native plants in the landscape can have a positive impact on the amount of pollinators we observe, kind of regardless of the neighborhood context of those parks. So in built up areas or areas that are surrounded by fairly semi-natural kind of landscapes or residential landscapes, we see high pollinator diversity in all those areas that are transitioned from bluegrass into more mixed native landscape plantings, not just some at the expense of others.
Cool. So when we talk about diversity of species that we are seeing more and more, if we can dive more into like what kind of species are we seeing more as a result of just the landscape transformation work that has been going on.
Intentionally or not, we have the wildlife habitat that urban wildlife species rely on and use every day. We have fox and coyote and deer and butterflies, a variety of pollinators, skunks and raccoons, and all of these urban wildlife species that people interact with every day. So we, as a park agency, we're trying to provide recreation for park users. But while we're doing that and creating this diversity of landscapes, we are also creating it for wildlife. So, as we continue to get more creative in our designs of landscapes, I think that will help us to get more creative in inviting a variety of different other wildlife species that we're not normally used to seeing.
Ecological interactions, population increases or declines of different species is going to happen around us, whether we want it or not. And in these really transformed landscapes like urban environments, we kind of have to choose what kind of ecological situations we want. So I think a lot about insect populations, and we can design our parks in intentional ways that creates habitat for beneficial insects like pollinators, or we can just kind of ignore these locations and treat them only as retention ponds or sort of unmanaged or undirected urban environments. But then you run the risk that the types of habitats you're unintentionally creating are really great for mosquitoes or invasive insect species that become pests for people's gardens. So species will fill those landscapes, but without intentionality, we kind of get the species that we don't want. But if we build resilience and we build habitat into those landscapes, we get, you'll still get some of those species that you don't want, but hopefully they'll be balanced out by beneficial insects, or, mosquito populations will be kept down by lots and lots of bats consuming those pest insects. So really it's about what kind of ecology we want.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to the type of wildlife and species population. What kind of wildlife are we seeing more as a result of this, if we can dive more into that?
As I kind of said earlier, that we're observing in our surveys of Denver parks that when there's high floral diversity or lots of different flower species within parks, we see lots of pollinators, and maybe that's somewhat intuitive. But I think what is really impressive that a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate is there's over 20,000 species of bee on Earth. And I think a lot of times we think of only the European honeybee, maybe bumblebees. We'll come back to the European honeybee maybe later. But I think what's really cool is that in Colorado, we have really high and impressive bee species diversity because of our varied landscapes. So there's over 1,000 different bee species in Colorado alone. And in our surveys of Denver parks, we've seen over 100 different species. And species numbers alone maybe isn't that interesting to people, but there are species that nest in the ground. There's species that nest in twigs and hollowed out logs. They cut little bits of leaves to make their nests. They eat different types of pollen. Some of them are parasites on other species of bee. So there's a ton of diversity and variation in life history. It's not just 100 different species doing the exact same thing.
As I mentioned earlier, the raccoons and the squirrels and the rats and the mice and the pollinators and the hawks and the eagles, they all use these urban environments because of the decrease in habitats from the various factors that are taking place. Our intention to create more of these habitats, whether they're individual habitats or habitats that are connected to other riparian corridors or larger habitats that have larger value, is important for this diversity of urban species that we have now, and hopefully will encourage more of in our park system.
I'll just say on an experiential level too, when I'm out in the field pulling weeds, riding my mower, riding my tractor, and I see an eagle or I see a red-tailed hawk, it just lifts my heart. It lifts my heart and it fills me with joy. Wildlife in parks, it's just pleasant. It's nice to go to the park and see a bunch of mallards with their little cucumber heads like bobbing around. It's nice to go and just like see a beaver dipping in and out of the water and pushing logs and twigs. It just gives you these little moments of respite from the busyness of urban life. And when I see those critters enjoying our parks, it makes me feel like I'm doing something right by the way of the stewardship practices that we implement in our parks.
Cool.
Yeah, and kind of on that same note of experiences, one really cool experience this summer in one of the parks was, well, I guess backing up a little bit, when I teach conservation, when I teach ecology, it's sometimes a lot of doom and gloom and really kind of a bummer. The students that I teach can get really kind of, bummed out or, low in morale. One of the studies that I published this past year that I was a co-author on, we basically projected that a species of bumblebee that used to be the most common in the region, the western bumblebee, is expected to decline and be lost from over 90% of its range by the end of the century, which, is the bummer part of this story. But the fun part of the story is this summer when we were doing surveys in Denver parks, we found a western bumblebee male in one of the parks that is fairly interior to Denver. And that species hasn't been observed within Denver, or at least documented within Denver, in over 30 years. So it's, there's potential to kind of recover these species, even in these, so-called non-native habitats or non-natural habitats.
What can we do today intentionally to try to retain those species that we may not have, at the end of this century? Like, what can we do proactively today to stop that, stop those species from like dying and disappearing?
Well, I'll let others comment on larger animals, and I'll just start with insects. But this might be a good time to mention that one thing we should not do if we're concerned about pollinators is keep honeybees or go out and become a beekeeper. If you're really enthusiastic about beekeeping because you're really into honey or you want an agriculturally based hobby or something, there are responsible ways to be a beekeeper potentially. But generally when people ask me, what can I do to support pollinators or help bees? It's really important that we understand that the European honeybee is a non-native species to North America. So it was introduced here. And at high population densities, honeybees can actually negatively affect native species of bee, either through competition for resources or more commonly, potentially by disease spillover from honeybees to native bee populations. So don't keep honeybees if you're concerned about saving the bees, but plant native plants, plant plants that produce lots of pollen and nectar, plant the things that bring you joy as long as they're not invasive. Native status doesn't matter a super ton within your backyard. And leave your yard, leave your garden spaces a little bit messy if you can, as that helps with overwintering habitat and other non-foraging parts of their life cycle. But also just learn a bit about the native pollinators and communicate what you learn to your friends and your neighbors. There's a whole bunch of diversity in these things, and once you kind of appreciate that, it makes it easier to see how you can support them.
Yeah. I'm fascinated by what you pointed out about honeybees, because I think it's a pretty big misconception. I personally thought that we want honeybees in our environment.
These species are really kind of fascinating because early in the spring, you might see really huge bumblebees flying around, and these are queen bumblebees. And so they start their season as solitary individuals. They don't have workers. They don't have an entourage like honeybees do. Instead, they start as these really, really big, like almost golf ball sized solitary individuals. And they found a nest. they produce their colony throughout the season. And they make these like really messy, ramshackle looking colonies that live for only a year. And then at the end of the season, new queens and males are produced, and only those queens survive. But they use, if you want to attract bumblebees to your yard, for example, planting legumes. Vetches or lupins can be really popular with bumblebees. If you want to attract a really large diversity of bees just kind of in general, then sunflowers and various types of composites can be really good things to plant. And if you plant those, you'll get metallic green bees, you'll get fuzzy blue kind of metallic looking bees, you'll get all sorts of crazy striping patterns and different colors of legs and stuff. Huge diversity in color and shape and beauty.
Yeah.
There's a lot of partners that are working with Denver Parks and others to educate residents on how they can build more of this habitat in their yard. And so the Denver Park Trust is piloting the pollinator trail. And so they've identified a few parks, including Argo Park and Global Landing, and I think they're going to add 39th Greenway, where we have a lot of this diversity. But then residents and business owners can also opt in to transform their yard and start building kind of this like trail and increase like the density of diversity of plants within these neighborhoods. So that's a really cool program that people can get involved in if they want to learn more about it too.
Yeah.
And CSU Extension has some great resources online for different plant lists and things people might consider planting to attract bees as well as butterflies. They have some butterfly specific lists.
And similar to what Sensoray is talking about with regard to creating different types of habitats, we have our Community Wildlife Habitat Program. It's through the National Wildlife Federation, and it's a program where we're encouraging residents and businesses and partner agencies to create habitats, however small or large, as long as it has food, water, shelter, and space, and create this variety of habitats throughout the city that continues to build the variety of habitats that wildlife depend on. So whether it's a pollinator garden or, a garden in your yard that invites rabbits and squirrels and sometimes considered pests, but people like to see those critters too. So that's the importance of the Community Wildlife Habitat Program. And with that, we're also working with Denver Public Schools to encourage them and their students to create community gardens where the community can get together and create a garden that invites pollinators, or even a food garden for that matter, for the community.
Yeah. I want to, go ahead.
I just want to go back to the excitement that Ryan brought earlier about how we've talked a lot about how important this work is for the environment and for the species we're trying to protect. But I think Parks also has a responsibility to do this work for our residents as well. I think there's a lot of research that shows that connection to nature and having that access and equitable access is really important for health and mental health. So I think it's important that we, bring in how this impacts our communities as well, along with all of the environmental benefits. And I just think it's important that we also make sure we're looking at just that access, because not everyone can get in their car and go to a national park or go up to mountain parks so easily. And so we want to make sure that we have these spaces for across the whole city as well.
Can we talk more also about just the environmental impact? What, just in large scale, just beyond the mental health, what are some of the other benefits for our environment?
I suppose technically at CSU, I teach forest ecology. So I don't just talk about bees all day. So, one really big benefit of these natural spaces is mitigation of urban heat island effects. So, when we have these built up concrete environments and we have increasingly warm temperatures, you can get sort of this multiplicative effect where not only is it warmer because the climate is warming, but it's even warmer because the city is built up. But as we have a greater and greater proportion of green spaces or canopy cover, that can help to mitigate that negative effects of heating. And that can have huge benefits in terms of, reduction in hospital visits during heat wave events, as well as, more sort of consistent but less dramatic positive benefits like reduction in cooling costs and the use of AC units, basically. That canopy cover, those habitats in urban environments can be really important for filtering of air and improvements of air quality. So you also see reduced hospital visits there. So I think untold benefits.
We're seeing a huge decline in wetland habitat across the country. And so that's an area that we're really trying to ensure that we're protecting that kind of wetland and riparian and stream corridor, because that's where we see a lot of diversity. And those corridors are really critical for the movement of wildlife throughout the city as well. But I mean, riparian, so that area kind of upland from the wetland stream edge, and wetlands themselves filter a ton of pollutants that come off of our streets that have sediments and other heavy metals in them, and filter that out before it gets into our stream systems. And so these vegetation types and diversity are so critical to the ecosystem services that they provide for just a healthy environment, which again, all rolls back up into having a healthy community.
When you look at native grasslands, those plants actually store tons of carbon underneath the ground. So there's a whole nother layer kind of beyond our visible range that is doing important environmental work. And when we start thinking about grassroots, our native grasses, our blue stems, our panicums, those all have significantly deeper root systems than a traditional turf grass like a Kentucky blue does. So they're holding the soil together and making the entire landscape more resilient to shocks by the way of flooding or trampling or any of these other disturbances that we encounter in an urban environment.
We all talk about the importance of these habitats that we create, wetlands and natural areas, but we also have to consider the people aspect of it. For us, because we work in the area of natural resources and natural places, we know the benefits that beaver, for example, have in a riparian corridor and in a riparian ecosystem. They build these great depths of pools of water that creates a whole other ecosystem for other wildlife, ducks and geese and microorganisms in the water. But for people who are using our parks, for example, that see a beaver building a dam or a lodge that is backing up water onto a public trail, may not see that benefit. So that's the other piece of our job in having to, or at least trying to find some creative ways to educate the public about the importance of these ecosystems, because it's not always an easy message to deliver to the public when something is happening to them.
So Denver recently had more than 50 of its parks certified as community wildlife habitats. Can we talk about some of the requirements to be certified as a community wildlife habitat?
The Community Wildlife Habitat Program encourages residents to create habitats, however large or small they want to create. But these habitats have to have 4 elements, which is food, water, shelter, and space. And that can be in the form of anything. When you think about water, is a bird bath, for example, receiving water just from the rainfall that we get? Or can we create a habitat through rocks and leaves and pieces of earth? So as long as people are creating these habitats with these elements, they go towards the program, the Community Wildlife Program, where as a city, we are a certified Community Wildlife Habitat city, which we just received our certification 2 years ago. And to continue that certification, we have to engage in conservation efforts throughout the city. So as we're teaching, educating the public about how to create habitats, how to pick certain plants to make their habitats more valuable, We are also at the same time gaining certification, maintaining our certification. And that's really the goal, is not only to engage our community, but also to engage partner agencies, businesses, schools, anybody who has an interest in wildlife, and encouraging populations, not just of plants, but also insects and other wildlife in their area.
What is the long-term vision in terms of habitat protection within our park system? What should we expect to see more in the future?
Yeah, we're using a lot of the data that John mentioned to really start to identify and prioritize where do we have dead zones in the city of biodiversity and within our parks. So you are going to start to see more projects that transition some of our non-functional turf to more of these native landscapes we've been discussing today. So again, we're very intentional. We're not taking bluegrass and landscapes away where we have a lot of active recreation. We want to balance, these park spaces and again, what they're intended for, of people having outdoor access to recreation, but also providing these spaces for wildlife too. And so we've been prioritizing and identifying a lot of projects throughout the entire city where we can incrementally start to reduce some of that turf.
Sometimes I think we talk about these things almost as if they're an either or. You either have habitat or you have recreational land. But, I play a lot of disc golf in the Midwest when I go out there for some of my work. And on some of those courses, I've found endangered rusty patch bumblebees foraging on plants that, are kind of in the margins of the disc golf course. There's also biking trails and cross-country skiing trails and all sorts of other activities that happen right alongside these habitats. So I just think it's kind of cool to, imagine how these lands can achieve both recreation and restoration goals at the same time.
So we talked about some of the resources that you've mentioned, like we mentioned the Denver Park Trust, the CSU extension. Is there anything else that viewers of this podcast should be aware of when we talk about habitat protection?
Yeah, I think going to denvergov.org/nature and going to the It's in Denver's Nature's landing page, we have listed out a lot of these resources, so it can be a great kind of one-stop shop. And then we'll provide links to the others that were mentioned today. But I think that's a great first stop. And then if there's ever any questions, you can reach out directly.
Thank you all again, and tune in for the next and final episode of It's in Denver's Nature, where we will talk about urban canopy.